The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday morning, turning the streets of San Jose into rivers of memory. Charlotte Wilson stood at her kitchen window, watching the water-carved paths through the garden she'd planted 23 years ago, the same garden she'd been tending the day the detectives first came to her door. Her hands trembled as she held her coffee mug, the ceramic warm against her palms, but not warm enough to chase away the chill that had settled into her bones. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The knock came at 6:47 a.m. She knew before she opened the door. Perhaps she'd always known. Perhaps every quiet morning for the past 2 decades had been borrowed time, each sunrise a gift she hadn't earned. Through the frosted glass, she could see their silhouettes, 2 figures in dark coats, rain dripping from their shoulders like the weight of judgment itself. Detective Maria Santos stood on the porch, her face carved from something harder than the stone steps beneath her feet. Beside her, a younger detective, male, nervous, his hand resting near his hip in that way cops do when they're not sure what they're walking into. Maria's eyes met Charlotte's through the opening door, and in that moment, 23 years collapsed into nothing. Charlotte Wilson? Maria's voice was professional, distant, but Charlotte heard the tremor beneath it. They'd known each other once, in passing, at community meetings back when the neighborhood still gathered in living rooms to discuss safety and streetlights and the small concerns of people who thought they were safe. "You know it's me, Maria." Charlotte's voice came out steadier than she expected. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in. You'll want to sit down for this." The living room looked like it had been frozen in 2002. The same cream-colored sofa, now worn at the arms where Charlotte's fingers had gripped it during countless sleepless nights. The same oak coffee table her husband had built before the cancer took him in 1998. The same framed photographs on the mantel, her daughter's graduation, her son's wedding, grandchildren she'd held with hands that had done unspeakable things. Maria didn't sit. She stood in the center of the room, water pooling at her feet, and pulled out a folded paper from inside her coat. "Charlotte Wilson, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of David Chen on the night of October 14th, 2002. The words hung in the air like smoke. Charlotte felt her legs give way, and she sank onto the sofa, that familiar worn fabric catching her as it had so many times before. The younger detective, his badge read Harrison, moved forward with handcuffs, but Maria raised a hand, stopping him. "Let her have a moment," Maria said quietly. Charlotte looked up at them, these harbingers of a reckoning she'd both feared and, in her darkest hours, longed for. "How?" The word came out as a whisper. "How did you find out?" Maria's expression shifted, something like pity crossing her features before she locked it away. "DNA technology. We reopened the case 6 months ago when new federal funding came through for cold cases. The blood on the tire iron, we ran it through the updated databases. Your DNA was in the system from that volunteer health screening at the community center in 2019. You remember? The one where you donated blood for the American Red Cross drive." Charlotte remembered. She'd felt so proud that day, rolling up her sleeve, doing something good for the community. The irony tasted like copper in her mouth. "I need to tell you something," Charlotte said, her voice gaining strength. "Before we go, before this becomes what it's going to become, I need you to understand." Harrison shifted uncomfortably, but Maria nodded slowly. "You have the right to remain silent. I know my rights. I've been living with them in my head for 23 years. Charlotte stood, moving to the mantel, her fingers trailing over a photograph of a young girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. "This is Rebecca." Was Rebecca. She was 17. Maria's face remained impassive, but Charlotte saw her jaw tighten. David Chen was her boyfriend. Everyone thought he was such a nice boy, polite, good grades. His parents owned that restaurant on First Street. You remember it? Golden Dragon. They were pillars of the community. Charlotte's voice broke on the last word. Rebecca died on October 12, 2002. The official cause was suicide, overdose of sleeping pills. They found her in his car, parked by the reservoir. The room fell silent except for the rain hammering against the windows. "I knew," Charlotte continued. "A mother knows. The bruises she tried to hide. The way she flinched when his name was mentioned. The light that went out of her eyes over those 6 months they were together. I tried to get her to leave him. I begged her. But she was 17 and thought she was in love. And I was just her mother who didn't understand." She turned to face the detectives, tears streaming down her face now, hot against her cold skin. "He killed her. Made it look like suicide. I went to the police. Not you, Maria. This was before your time. And they looked at me like I was a grieving mother making wild accusations. David had an alibi. His parents vouched for him. The investigation was closed in 3 days." Maria's voice was softer now. "Charlotte, 2 days after they closed the case, I went to his house. It was raining just like today. His parents were at the restaurant working late. I brought my husband's old tire iron from the garage. I told myself I was just going to talk to him, make him confess, make him tell the truth about what he did to my baby girl." Charlotte's hands shook as she wrapped her arms around herself. "But when he opened the door and smiled at me," smiled Maria, "like nothing had happened, like my daughter hadn't just been buried 3 days before, something inside me broke." "We need to go now," Harrison said, his voice tight with discomfort, but Maria held up her hand again. "Finish," she said to Charlotte. "He let me in. Thought I was there to give him something of Rebecca's, some memento. We stood in his living room, right there by his father's display case of porcelain figures, and I asked him why. Why did you hurt her? Why did you kill her? And you know what he said?" Charlotte's voice rose, 23 years of anguish pouring out. "He said, 'Your daughter was weak. She couldn't handle real life.' Those were his exact words. She couldn't handle real life." The tire iron had felt heavy in Charlotte's hands, heavier than it had any right to be. But when she'd swung it, when it had connected with David Chen's skull, the weight had lifted. For one terrible, transcendent moment, she'd felt free. "I never meant to kill him. I meant to hurt him, make him feel what Rebecca felt." But he fell, hit his head on the corner of that display case. The porcelain figures shattered everywhere. There was so much blood. Charlotte's voice dropped to a whisper. "I panicked. I cleaned up as best I could. Took the tire iron home, washed it, put it back in the garage. His parents found him the next morning. The police ruled it a robbery gone wrong. His wallet was missing because he'd left it in his car. No one ever connected it to me." Maria finally moved, taking a step closer. "Charlotte, I need to read you your rights now." "I know. I'm ready." Charlotte held out her wrists. "But Maria, you need to know. I'm not sorry for what I did. I'm sorry it took this long for the truth to come out. I'm sorry my children and grandchildren will have to live with this shame. But I'm not sorry that David Chen is dead. He took my daughter from me and the system failed her. Failed us both." As Harrison clicked the handcuffs around Charlotte's wrists, cold metal against skin that had aged and weathered and carried the secret through 2 decades, she felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. The weight she'd been carrying, the constant vigilance, the fear that had colored every moment of joy with her family, all of it began to lift. Maria guided her toward the door, gentle despite the circumstances. "We'll need to contact your family. Is there someone we should call?" "My son, Michael. His number is on the refrigerator." Charlotte paused at the threshold, looking back at her living room one last time. On the coffee table sat a small wooden box, hand-carved, with a lotus flower on the lid. Inside were Rebecca's things, a bracelet, a few photographs, a journal Charlotte had never been able to bring herself to read. "Can you make sure Michael gets that box? The one on the table. He'll know what to do with it." The rain had intensified, turning the morning into a gray blur. As they walked her to the unmarked car, Charlotte saw her neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, standing on her porch with a hand pressed to her mouth. They'd been friends for 30 years. They'd raised their children together, shared recipes and gossip and the quiet intimacies of suburban life. Now Mrs. Pacheco was watching her being led away in handcuffs, and Charlotte could see the exact moment their friendship ended. could see the trust crumble like the porcelain figures in David Chen's living room. In the back of the car, Charlotte closed her eyes and let herself remember Rebecca as she'd been before David. Bright and fierce and full of impossible dreams. She'd wanted to be a marine biologist, had plastered her bedroom walls with pictures of sea creatures and coral reefs. She'd had a laugh that could fill a house with light. The car pulled away from the curb, from the house where Charlotte had raised her children and buried her husband and nurtured her terrible secret. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched her life recede, becoming smaller and smaller until it was just another house on another street in a city full of secrets and sorrow. Detective Maria Santos sat in the front passenger seat, her phone pressed to her ear, already making the calls that would set the machinery of justice in motion. But she glanced in the rearview mirror once, catching Charlotte's eye, and in that brief connection, Charlotte saw something she hadn't expected. Understanding. Not approval, perhaps, but understanding. The question that would haunt the community in the days to come, that would split neighborhoods and families and friendships along invisible fault lines, was already forming in Charlotte's mind. When the system fails, when justice closes its eyes, what becomes of a mother's love? What becomes of rage that has nowhere to go but inward, until it explodes? She didn't have an answer. She only had the truth, heavy and undeniable, finally spoken aloud after 23 years of silence. And somewhere, in a cemetery across town, beneath a headstone that read Rebecca Wilson, beloved daughter. The rain fell like tears that were finally being shed. The San Jose County Jail smelled like industrial cleaner and defeat. Charlotte sat on the edge of a thin mattress in her holding cell, her orange jumpsuit stiff and unfamiliar against her skin. She'd been photographed, fingerprinted, processed through a system she'd only ever seen on television. Her wedding ring had been placed in a plastic bag with the rest of her personal effects, and the absence of it on her finger felt like another small death. It was 3 p.m. when her son arrived. Michael Wilson looked like his father. Same strong jaw, same thoughtful eyes, but in that moment, walking through the visitation room door, he looked like a man whose world had just shattered. He was 42 years old, a software engineer at a firm in Palo Alto, married with 3 children. He'd lived his entire adult life believing his mother was a woman who volunteered at the library, who made the best apple pie in the county, who sent birthday cards that always arrived exactly on time. He sat down across from her, separated by scratched plexiglass, and picked up the phone. His hand shook. "Mom!" Just that one word, and Charlotte heard everything in it. Confusion, betrayal, disbelief, and underneath it all, a love so deep it hurt to witness. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice crackling through the phone. "Michael, I'm so sorry you had to find out this way. Is it true?" His eyes searched her face, looking for the mother he knew, trying to reconcile her with the woman who'd been arrested for murder. "Did you really with Rebecca?" "Yes." Charlotte's hand pressed against the glass, as if she could reach through it and touch him one more time. "Every word they're saying is true." Michael closed his eyes, his jaw working as he processed this. When he opened them again, tears had gathered at the corners. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell anyone? For 23 years, Mom. 23 years. How could she explain? How could she make him understand that every single day had been a war between the truth and the life she tried to build in the aftermath? That every time she'd held his children, her grandchildren, she'd felt the ghost of the daughter she'd lost pressing against her heart? "Do you remember what you were like after Rebecca died?" Charlotte asked softly. "You were 19, home from college, and you stopped eating, stopped sleeping. You'd sit in her room for hours, just staring at her things. Your father and I were terrified we were going to lose you too." Michael's throat worked as he swallowed. "I remember. If I'd told you what I did, if you'd known that I'd killed the boy everyone thought was Rebecca's grieving boyfriend, what would that have done to you? To your sister Sarah? To your father, who was already dying?" Charlotte leaned forward, willing him to understand. "I made a choice. I chose to carry it alone so that you could have a chance at a normal life. So you could heal without the weight of what I'd done crushing you. That wasn't your choice to make." Michael's voice broke. "We could have helped you. We could have. Done what? Turned me in? Become accomplices? No, Michael. This was mine to bear. Charlotte wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I need you to know something. The woman who raised you, who taught you how to ride a bike and helped you with your homework and was there when Emily was born, that woman was real. She wasn't a lie. The love was real. It was always real. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 23 years of deception hanging between them. Around them, other families conducted their own painful conversations, voices rising and falling in the sterile room. Tell me about that day, Michael said finally. About what really happened with Rebecca. So Charlotte told him. She told him about the bruises Rebecca had tried to hide with long sleeves in summer. About the time she'd found her daughter crying in the bathroom, scrubbing at her arms until they were raw, saying she needed to be cleaner, better, good enough. About the conversations Charlotte had tried to have, the help she'd offered, and how Rebecca had pushed her away with the fierce independence of 17. She told him about the night 2 weeks before Rebecca died, when she'd woken to strange sounds and found her daughter standing in the backyard at 2 a.m., staring up at the stars. I asked her what she was doing, Charlotte said, her voice thick with memory. She said she was trying to remember what it felt like to be weightless. I didn't understand then, but later, after she was gone, I realized she was already planning to leave. She was already saying goodbye. Michael listened, his face pale, his knuckles white where he gripped the phone. The police didn't want to hear it. When I showed them the bruises in the photos I'd secretly taken, they said they could have come from anywhere. When I told them Rebecca had been terrified of David, they showed me text messages he'd sent her. Sweet, loving messages. They said I was grieving, seeing things that weren't there. Charlotte's voice hardened. But a mother knows, Michael. A mother knows when her child is in danger. She told him about the autopsy report she'd demanded, how it had shown old injuries consistent with abuse, but the detective handling the case had dismissed them as unrelated. About how David's father had connections in the police department, how the case had been closed with almost suspicious speed. I tried to do it the right way, Charlotte said. I tried to let the system work, but the system protected him, not her. So I became the justice Rebecca deserved. Michael was quiet for a long time after she finished. Finally, he said, What you did was still murder, Mom. You know that, right? Whatever David did, whatever the police didn't do, you still took a life. I know. Charlotte met his eyes steadily. I've lived with that knowledge every single day. It's colored everything. Every birthday, every holiday, every quiet moment. When I held your children, I thought about David's mother, how I'd taken her son from her. When I volunteered at the library, I wondered if I deserved to be around children at all. The guilt never left, Michael. Not for one moment. Then why? His voice rose, drawing glances from nearby visitors. If you knew it was wrong, if you've been tormented by it all this time, why did you do it? Because love makes you capable of terrible things. Charlotte's voice was steady now, certain. Because when you lose a child, when someone takes your baby from you and faces no consequences, something primitive takes over. All the civilization, all the rules we agree to follow, they mean nothing compared to the howl of a mother's grief. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying I couldn't stop myself. And if I could go back, if I could stand in that moment again with the tire iron in my hands and David Chen's smiling face in front of me, I would make the same choice. That's what makes me guilty, Michael. Not just of the crime, but of the willingness to do it again. The visiting hour drew to a close. A guard called out that they had 5 minutes remaining. Michael slumped in his chair, looking older than his years. What do you need from me? He asked finally. A lawyer, if you can afford one. Someone who'll at least listen to the whole story. Charlotte tried to smile. And maybe someday, after you've had time to process this, you could bring the kids to see me? I know that's asking a lot. Mom, I don't know if I can do that. Michael's voice cracked. Sarah called me before I came here. She's devastated. Her kids are asking questions. The media is already camped outside your house, outside our houses. They're calling you a vigilante, a murderer. Some people are even calling you a hero. It's chaos. Charlotte nodded, accepting this. I understand. You have to protect your family. That's what parents do. Were you protecting us? Michael asked. All these years, was it really about protecting us? Or was it about protecting yourself from facing what you'd done? The question hit like a physical blow. Charlotte opened her mouth to answer, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right, wasn't he? Somewhere along the way, the noble lie of protecting her family had become a comfortable shelter for her own cowardice. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe it was both. Maybe I convinced myself I was being selfless when really I was just afraid. Afraid of losing you and Sarah. Afraid of facing the consequences. Afraid of being alone with what I'd done. Time's up, the guard called. Michael stood slowly, the phone still pressed to his ear. I need time, Mom. I need to figure out how to reconcile the mother I knew with the woman who's sitting in front of me now. I don't know if I can. I know. Take all the time you need. Charlotte stood as well, pressing her palm against the glass one more time. I love you, Michael. That's real. Whatever else was a lie, that was always real. He nodded, tears streaming down his face now, and hung up the phone. Charlotte watched him walk away, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a truth he'd never asked to carry. The door closed behind him, and she was alone. Back in her cell, Charlotte lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. The walls were covered in scratches and messages from previous occupants. Declarations of innocence, prayers, names of loved ones. She found a spot near her bunk and, using her thumbnail, began to scratch a single word into the concrete. Rebecca. The days that followed blurred into a routine of institutional life. Breakfast at 6 a.m., exercise in a concrete yard, lunch, more sitting, dinner, lights out. Charlotte moved through it like a ghost, detached from her body, watching herself play the role of prisoner. Other inmates tried to talk to her. News of her arrest had spread. The cold case cracked, the respectable suburban mother revealed to be a killer. Some women looked at her with hostility, seeing her as a reminder of the system that had locked them away. Others approached with a strange kind of respect, wanting to know her story. One woman, a 40-something named Diana serving time for drug possession, sat next to Charlotte in the common area on her fourth day inside. You're the one who killed that boy, she said without preamble. The one who hurt your daughter. Charlotte nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Good, Diana said simply. My daughter's in foster care now because her father beat her and I didn't stop him in time. Wish I'd had your courage. It wasn't courage, Charlotte said quietly. It was rage. There's a difference. Maybe not. Diana shrugged. All I know is you did what I should have done. You protected your child, even if it was too late. The conversation haunted Charlotte. Was that what she'd done? Protected Rebecca? Or had she simply enacted revenge that satisfied nothing and saved no one? The distinction seemed important, but the harder she tried to grasp it, the more it slipped away. A court-appointed lawyer came on day 6. Her name was Jennifer Park, a young Korean-American woman with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She sat across from Charlotte in a small meeting room and laid out the situation with brutal honesty. The DNA evidence is solid. Your confession to the arresting officers, even though you were emotionally distraught, is admissible. The prosecution has a strong case. Jennifer tapped her pen against her notepad. But there's a story here, Mrs. Wilson. A story about a mother, a failed investigation, and a system that let your daughter down. If we play this right, we might be able to avoid a life sentence. I don't want to avoid anything, Charlotte said. I did what I did. I deserve whatever consequences come. With all due respect, that's not how this works. Jennifer leaned forward. You have a family who needs you, grandchildren who deserve to know their grandmother. And whether you believe it or not, your story matters. There are other mothers out there, other victims, who need to see that someone finally stood up and said enough. Charlotte thought of Rebecca's journal, the one she'd never been able to read. Michael had it now, the wooden box with the lotus flower. If I fight this, I have to talk about Rebecca. I have to air everything, the abuse, the investigation that failed, all of it. Is that fair to her memory? Is it fair to her memory to let her death mean nothing? Jennifer countered. Mrs. Wilson, your daughter died because someone hurt her and faced no consequences. You took justice into your own hands, and that was wrong, legally speaking. But you can make it mean something now. You can shine a light on how domestic violence cases are handled, especially when the victim is young and the abuser seems like a nice boy from a good family. The idea settled into Charlotte's chest like a stone. To make Rebecca's death mean something. To turn this tragedy into a catalyst for change. It felt both right and impossibly presumptuous. Let me think about it, Charlotte said. That night, unable to sleep, Charlotte found herself thinking about the ordinary days that had made up the years after Rebecca's death. The way she'd learned to function with a hole in her chest where her daughter used to be. The slow return to routines, grocery shopping, cooking dinner, tending the garden. The effort it took to smile at Michael and Sarah, to be present for their lives when part of her had died with Rebecca. She thought about her husband, Tom, and the way he'd held her the night after she'd killed David Chen. She'd come home with blood on her shoes, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. He'd found her in the bathroom, scrubbing her hands raw, and he'd turned off the water and held her while she sobbed. She'd never told him what she'd done, but he'd known. Somehow he'd known, and he'd never asked. In his own way, he'd carried the secret too, right up until the cancer took him 4 years later. His last words to her, whispered in the hospice bed, had been, "You did what you had to do. Don't let it eat you alive." Too late, Tom. Too late. A guard's footsteps echoed down the corridor, and Charlotte closed her eyes, letting exhaustion finally pull her under. She dreamed of Rebecca as a little girl, running through the sprinklers in the backyard, her laughter bright as bells. In the dream, Charlotte tried to call out to her, to warn her about what was coming, but her voice wouldn't work. She could only watch as Rebecca ran farther and farther away, until she disappeared into a light that swallowed everything. The news broke like a dam bursting. Within 48 hours of Charlotte's arrest, every major news outlet in the Bay Area was running the story. Cold case solved. Mother admits to 2002 revenge killing. The headlines varied, but the narrative was always the same. Respectable woman, beloved community member, secret murderer. What the media hadn't expected was the response. The first protest appeared outside the San Jose courthouse on the morning of Charlotte's arraignment. 50 women, holding signs that read, "Justice for Rebecca," and "Mothers Stand with Charlotte." By the afternoon, the number had doubled. By evening, it had become a movement. Detective Maria Santos stood at her office window, watching the growing crowd below. Her partner, Harrison, sat at his desk reviewing case files, but his attention kept drifting to the chants rising from the street. "This is getting out of control," he muttered. "We arrested a murderer. Since when do murderers get fan clubs?" Maria turned from the window, her expression troubled. "Since people stopped trusting the system to protect their children. This isn't about Charlotte Wilson anymore, Harrison. It's about every mother who's been ignored, every victim who wasn't believed. She killed someone with a tire iron. Premeditated murder." Harrison's voice rose. "Are we really going to pretend that's okay because she had a sympathetic motive? I'm not saying it's okay. I'm saying I understand why it's resonating." Maria sat down heavily. "I pulled the original case file on Rebecca Wilson's death. The investigation was a joke. 3 days, minimal follow-up, and it was closed. The detective who handled it, Frank Russo, retired in 2003 with a full pension. He now lives in Arizona and refuses to comment." Harrison's jaw tightened. "You think the investigation was botched deliberately?" "I think David Chen's father made a very large donation to the Police Benevolent Association in November 2002. I think Detective Russo was 6 months from retirement and didn't want to rock the boat. And I think a 17-year-old girl died and no one cared enough to dig deeper." Maria's voice was bitter. "So yeah, I understand the protests." In her cell, Charlotte was unaware of the growing movement outside. She spent her days in a fog of exhaustion and introspection, refusing to watch the news when other inmates told her she'd become a symbol. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be someone who'd made a terrible mistake and was paying for it, not someone whose crime was being held up as righteous. But the world had other plans. Sarah, Charlotte's younger daughter, broke her silence 5 days after the arrest. At 38, she was a high school history teacher in Oakland, a woman who'd built her life on principles of justice and fairness. She'd spent those 5 days in a crisis of conscience, torn between the mother she loved and the crime she'd committed. She chose love. In a Facebook post that went viral within hours, Sarah wrote, "My mother killed someone. That is a fact, and she will face the consequences. But before you judge her, before you condemn her as a monster, I want you to know what the justice system did to my sister. I want you to know how we begged for help and were turned away. I want you to know that the boy my sister loved was her killer, and the police protected him while she rotted in the ground." The post included photos. Rebecca at 15, bright-eyed and hopeful. Rebecca at 16, something dimming behind her smile. Rebecca at 17, 2 weeks before her death, her eyes haunted and distant. And finally, photos Sarah had found in Rebecca's room after her death. Selfies showing bruises on her arms, her neck, her ribs, time-stamped and saved as evidence Rebecca had been too afraid to show anyone while alive. The internet exploded. Within hours, #JusticeForRebecca was trending nationally. Within a day, similar stories began emerging. Women sharing experiences of abuse, of reporting it, of being ignored or dismissed. Mothers talking about daughters lost to intimate partner violence. The conversation expanded beyond Charlotte, beyond Rebecca, becoming a reckoning with how society treats young women in abusive relationships. The prosecutor assigned to Charlotte's case, a career-focused woman named Amanda Chen, no relation to David, found herself in the uncomfortable position of prosecuting someone who'd become a folk hero to a vocal segment of the population. She held a press conference on day 7, her expression grim. "I understand that this case has touched a nerve," she said, cameras flashing. "I understand that many people feel the original investigation into Rebecca Wilson's death was inadequate, but we cannot allow personal tragedy to justify murder. We are a nation of laws, not vigilantes. Charlotte Wilson will be prosecuted to the fullest extent, and justice will be served." The assembled reporters erupted with questions. One voice rose above the rest. Wasn't justice already served when David Chen died? Where was justice for Rebecca? Amanda Chen's face tightened. "That's not how our system works. Maybe it should be," someone shouted from the back. The press conference devolved into chaos. Videos of the exchange spread online, with commentators on both sides weighing in. Conservative pundits called Charlotte a murderer who deserved life in prison. Progressive activists called her a victim of a broken system. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the complicated middle. Inside the San Jose County Jail, Charlotte's world narrowed to routines and small rebellions. She learned which guards were sympathetic and which viewed her with open contempt. She learned that commissary day was Friday, that the best time for a shower was early morning before everyone else woke, that you could trade cigarettes for almost anything even if you didn't smoke. A woman named Teresa, serving time for vehicular manslaughter, became something like a friend. They'd sit together during meals, not always talking, just existing in each other's space. Teresa had accidentally hit a pedestrian while driving drunk 2 years ago. She'd been sober ever since, attending every AA meeting the prison offered, carrying her guilt like a physical weight. "You ever think about how one moment can destroy everything?" Teresa asked one day, pushing her food around her tray. "I got behind the wheel drunk. That's all it took. One stupid decision and a man died. A father, a husband. His family will never forgive me. I'll never forgive myself." Charlotte looked at her own hands, remembering how they'd felt wrapped around the tire iron. "I think about it constantly, the weight of a single choice." "But yours was different," Teresa said softly. "You were trying to protect your daughter, even if it was too late. Mine was just stupidity, selfishness. Does the intent matter if the result is the same? We both took lives. We both destroyed families." Charlotte's voice was hollow. I keep asking myself if David Chen's mother thinks about intent. If it makes any difference to her that I did it out of grief rather than cruelty. The question haunted the national conversation too. David Chen's family had released a single statement through their lawyer. David was our beloved son, taken from us violently. Whatever mistakes he may have made as a young man, he did not deserve to die. We demand justice for him. The statement ignited another firestorm. Online sleuths began digging into David Chen's past, finding yearbook photos, old social media posts, anything that might support or refute Charlotte's claims about his character. A former girlfriend came forward, anonymously at first, claiming David had been controlling and occasionally violent with her too. Then another ex-girlfriend. Then a former friend who said David had a temper that could turn vicious. The picture that emerged was of a young man who'd been charming on the surface but dangerous underneath. But it was also incomplete, filtered through the lens of hindsight and public opinion. People who'd known David as kind and generous found themselves shouted down online. The nuance was lost in the noise. Michael Wilson, Charlotte's son, found himself at the center of an unwanted storm. His co-workers looked at him differently. His children came home from school with questions about grandma and murder and whether she was a hero or a villain. His wife, Emily, struggled to explain to their youngest, a 7-year-old boy named Daniel, why grandma wasn't coming to his birthday party. Is grandma a bad person? Daniel asked one night at dinner, his voice small. Michael looked at Emily, then at his older children, 2 teenage girls who'd grown up adoring their grandmother. How did you answer that question honestly? How did you tell your child that morality wasn't black and white, that good people could do terrible things, that justice and revenge sometimes looked identical from the outside? Grandma did something very wrong, Michael said finally. She hurt someone, and hurting people is never okay, no matter the reason. But she did it because she was in a lot of pain after Aunt Rebecca died, and sometimes pain makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. Is she sorry? Daniel asked. I think she's sorry about a lot of things. But mostly, she's sorry that she couldn't save Aunt Rebecca. Michael's voice broke. We're all sorry about that. The preliminary hearing took place 3 weeks after Charlotte's arrest. The courtroom was packed, with family members, journalists, curiosity seekers, and protesters who'd managed to secure seats. Charlotte sat at the defense table in a navy blue suit her daughter had brought, looking smaller than she had in months. Jennifer Park, her lawyer, sat beside her, radiating controlled intensity. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. DNA evidence linking Charlotte to the crime scene. Her confession to Detective Santos. The medical examiner's report detailing how David Chen had died from blunt force trauma to the skull. It was damning, straightforward, impossible to refute. Then Jennifer stood for the defense. Your Honor, we're not here to dispute that Charlotte Wilson killed David Chen. She has admitted to this, and she takes full responsibility for her actions. Jennifer's voice carried through the courtroom. But we need to understand the context of this tragedy. We need to examine what led a law-abiding mother, a woman who'd never even had a parking ticket, to commit such an act. She presented evidence of Rebecca's abuse, medical records showing old fractures, text messages Sarah had found on Rebecca's old phone expressing fear of David, testimony from a school counselor who'd noticed changes in Rebecca's behavior during her relationship with David. She presented the inadequate police investigation, showing how key evidence had been ignored or dismissed. The system failed Rebecca Wilson, Jennifer said, her voice rising with passion. And when it failed her, when she died and her killer walked free, her mother did what she felt was the only option left. We're not asking you to condone what she did. We're asking you to understand it. The prosecutor objected, arguing that the defense was trying to justify murder with emotional manipulation. The judge, a woman named Sandra Ortiz with 30 years on the bench, overruled the objection but cautioned Jennifer about the line between context and justification. In the gallery, Sarah Wilson sat with Michael and Emily, all 3 of them holding hands so tightly their knuckles had gone white. They'd discussed not coming, not wanting to be part of the spectacle, but in the end, family was family. They couldn't let Charlotte face this alone, no matter what she'd done. When Charlotte was asked if she wished to make a statement, she stood slowly. Jennifer had advised against it, but Charlotte had insisted. She needed to speak, needed to say the words that had been building in her chest for 23 years. "I killed David Chen," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I planned it, I carried it out, and I covered it up. For 23 years, I lied to everyone I loved about what I'd done. I stood at his funeral and watched his mother cry, knowing I was the cause of her grief. I'm guilty of murder, and I'm ready to face the consequences." A hush fell over the courtroom. "But I need everyone to understand something," Charlotte continued. "I didn't do this because I'm a violent person. I did it because I'm a mother who lost her child, and the people who were supposed to protect her didn't. I did it because David Chen killed my daughter and smiled about it. I did it because rage and grief are powerful things, and when you combine them with a feeling of powerlessness, they can make you capable of anything." She turned to face the gallery, her eyes finding the section where David Chen's family sat. His mother, now elderly and frail, his younger brother, both of them watching her with expressions of profound pain. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said directly to them. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry that my actions took your son and brother from you. I know my apology means nothing, that it can't undo what I did. But I need you to know that I understand I took something precious from you, just as your son took something precious from me. We're both mothers who've lost children. That's the terrible bond we share now." David's mother, Lily Chen, stood abruptly, her body shaking. "You monster," she said, her voice breaking. "You took my baby from me, my beautiful boy. He made mistakes, yes, but he was young. He could have changed, could have grown, could have become better. You stole that chance from him. You stole his future, his children, his life. And you dare to compare our losses." The bailiff moved to intervene, but Judge Ortiz held up a hand. "Let her speak." "Your daughter made her choice?" Lily Chen continued, tears streaming down her face. "My son didn't force those pills down her throat. She chose to leave. But you chose to take him from me. You chose to be judge, jury, and executioner. And now you stand there with your excuses and your apologies, and you expect us to what? Understand? Forgive." Charlotte felt each word like a blow. She wanted to argue, to scream that Rebecca hadn't chosen anything, that David had pushed her to that breaking point. But looking at Lily Chen's anguished face, she saw herself. A mother destroyed by loss, looking for someone to blame, desperate to make sense of senseless tragedy. "No," Charlotte said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to hear me say I'm sorry, even though I know it's not enough." Judge Ortiz called for order as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. She set a trial date for 6 months out, denying bail given the severity of the charges and the defendant's confession. Charlotte was remanded back to custody, the handcuffs clicking into place around her wrists once more. As she was let out, Charlotte looked back one last time. Sarah was crying. Michael had his arm around her. And in the back row, she saw Mrs. Pacheco, her old neighbor, who'd come despite everything. Their eyes met, and Mrs. Pacheco nodded once. Not approval, perhaps, but acknowledgement. A recognition that life was complicated, that good people sometimes did terrible things, and that judgment was easy from the outside. The weeks that followed brought more revelations. A journalist from the San Jose Mercury News did a deep dive into the 2002 investigation, uncovering emails between Detective Russo and the Chun family's lawyer that suggested undue influence on the investigation. The police chief was forced to announce an internal review of how domestic violence cases involving minors were handled. Protesters continued to gather at the courthouse, their numbers swelling with each new disclosure about the botched investigation. Counter-protesters appeared too, holding signs that read "Murder is murder" and "Justice for David Chen." The two groups clashed verbally, sometimes physically, requiring increased police presence. Inside the jail, Charlotte received letters. Hundreds of them. Some were hateful, calling her a murderer who deserved the worst the justice system could offer. But others were different. They came from mothers who'd lost daughters to violence. From survivors of abuse who said they understood. from people who'd watched the system fail their loved ones and had felt that same impotent rage. One letter, from a woman in Oregon, read, "My daughter was killed by her ex-boyfriend 5 years ago. He got 10 years and will be out in 3 for good behavior. I think about what you did every single day. I think about whether I have the courage to do it too. Thank you for making him pay for what he did to your daughter, even if the law says it was wrong." Charlotte read each letter carefully, then filed them away. They weren't absolution, nothing could absolve her, but they were evidence that her story mattered, that Rebecca's story mattered. Perhaps Jennifer had been right. Perhaps there was meaning to be found in this tragedy after all. But late at night, when the jail fell quiet and Charlotte lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, she didn't think about meaning or movements or justice. She thought about the weight of the tire iron in her hands. She thought about the sound it made when it connected with David Chen's skull. She thought about his mother's face in the courtroom, destroyed by grief. And she wondered, for the 1,000th time, if she'd had the right to decide who lived and who died, even if the law wouldn't. The question had no answer. It just echoed in the darkness, as persistent and merciless as memory itself. The trial began on a gray morning in April, 6 months after Charlotte's arrest. The courthouse had been transformed into a fortress, with barriers erected to keep protesters at a distance and metal detectors screening everyone who entered. Inside courtroom 4B, the air hummed with tension and anticipation. Charlotte wore the same navy suit, now slightly loose on her frame. 6 months in jail had changed her. She'd lost weight. Her hair had gone entirely gray, and there was a quality to her stillness that spoke of someone who'd made peace with whatever was coming. Michael and Sarah sat in the front row behind the defense table, a united front despite their private struggles with what their mother had done. The jury had been selected carefully, 8 women for men, ranging in age from 25 to 68. Each had been questioned extensively about their ability to remain impartial in a case that had divided public opinion so dramatically. The foreperson, a middle-aged librarian named Patricia Rodriguez, had assured both sides that she could base her decision solely on the evidence presented. Prosecutor Amanda Chun rose to give her opening statement, her posture straight, her voice clear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a complicated case. On October 14, 2002, Charlotte Wilson entered the home of 19-year-old David Chen with a tire iron. She struck him in the head with such force that his skull fractured. She left him to die on his living room floor, then went home, cleaned the weapon, and said nothing for 23 years. She paused, letting this sink in. The defense will try to make you feel sympathy for Mrs. Wilson. They'll talk about her daughter's death, about a failed investigation, about a mother's grief. And those things are tragic, truly tragic. But they don't change what she did. They don't make murder acceptable. We are here because no matter how much pain someone is in, no matter how wrong they feel, they don't get to decide who lives and dies. That's not justice. That's revenge." Jennifer Park's opening statement was different in every way. She spoke softly, drawing the jury in rather than projecting at them. "Charlotte Wilson is guilty of killing David Chen. She's admitted this, and we're not going to waste your time pretending otherwise. What we're here to determine is the full context of that guilt. Because justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about understanding how we got here, what failed, and what we owe to victims who are ignored by the system." She walked to the evidence table and picked up a photograph of Rebecca. "This is Rebecca Wilson. She was 17 years old when she died. Officially, her death was ruled a suicide. But what the original investigation didn't reveal, what it didn't want to reveal, was that Rebecca had been systematically abused by her boyfriend, David Chen, for months before her death. She tried to get help. Her mother tried to get help for her. They were ignored. Jennifer placed the photo on the jury box rail where they could all see it. So when you deliberate, when you decide what Charlotte Wilson deserves, I want you to ask yourselves, what would you do if your child was murdered and the person responsible faced no consequences? What would you do if the system you'd been taught to trust looked the other way? Charlotte Wilson's answer to those questions led her here. Your job is to decide if that answer, however wrong, is at least understandable. The prosecution's case was straightforward. DNA evidence, Forensic reports, Charlotte's confession. Dr. Raymond Lee, the medical examiner, testified about the cause of death. Massive trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. Crime scene photos were displayed, showing the Chen family living room, the broken porcelain figurines, the blood on the carpet that had been missed during the initial cleaning. Detective Maria Santos took the stand, her testimony careful and precise. She described the arrest, Charlotte's demeanor, her immediate admission of guilt. Did Mrs. Wilson express any remorse? Amanda Chen asked. Maria hesitated. She expressed regret that her family would be affected. She said she was sorry for the pain caused to David Chen's family. But when I asked if she regretted killing him, she said, Maria paused, consulting her notes. She said, I regret that it came to this, but I'm not sorry he's dead. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Charlotte sat motionless, her face betraying nothing. On cross-examination, Jennifer approached Maria with a different angle. Detective Santos, you reviewed the original investigation into Rebecca Wilson's death, correct? Yes. And what did you find? Maria's jaw tightened. I found significant gaps in the investigation. Evidence that should have been pursued wasn't. Witnesses who could have provided relevant information weren't interviewed. Can you give specific examples? Rebecca's best friend, Aisha Martinez, told investigators that Rebecca had confided in her about David's abuse. This was noted in the file but never followed up on. Medical records showing Rebecca had been treated for injuries consistent with abuse were requested but never obtained. David Chen was interviewed once, for 30 minutes, and accepted his alibi without verification. Why do you think such obvious investigative steps were skipped? Amanda Chen objected. Calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Ortiz ruled. But the point had been made. Jennifer moved on to other questions, establishing that Maria, a seasoned detective, found the original investigation deeply flawed. The defense's case began with Sarah Wilson. She took the stand wearing a simple black dress, her hands shaking as she was sworn in. Jennifer guided her gently through her testimony. Tell us about your sister, Rebecca. Sarah's voice was soft but steady. She was sunshine. That's what my dad used to call her. She lit up every room she entered. She wanted to save the oceans, protect sea turtles. She was passionate about everything she cared about. When did things change? When she started dating David. It was subtle at first. She spent less time with friends, stopped going to her marine biology club meetings. She said David needed her, that he got anxious when she wasn't around. We thought it was just teenage romance, you know? Intense but harmless. When did you realize it was more than that? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I came home from college for Thanksgiving, about 8 months before she died. Rebecca was wearing a turtleneck even though it was warm in the house. When I asked why, she said she had a rash. But I saw her changing later and there were bruises around her neck. When I asked about them, she got defensive, said I was being nosy, that David would never hurt her. Did you tell your parents? I told my mom. She'd already suspected something was wrong. She'd been trying to get Rebecca to talk, but Rebecca just pulled further away. Mom said she'd handle it, that she'd make sure Rebecca got help. And did Rebecca get help? Sarah's voice broke. No. She died 3 months later. Jennifer showed Sarah a series of text messages that had been recovered from Rebecca's old phone. They painted a disturbing picture. David demanding to know where Rebecca was at all times, accusing her of cheating when she spent time with friends, alternating between declarations of love and threats of self-harm if she left him. Did Rebecca ever talk to you about leaving David? Jennifer asked. Once, about a month before she died. She called me at school, crying. She said she wanted to break up with him but was afraid of what he'd do. He'd threatened to kill himself if she left, said it would be her fault. She felt trapped. Sarah wiped at her eyes. I told her to tell Mom and Dad to get help. She said she would. But then she just stopped. Stopped answering my calls. Stopped responding to texts. And then 2 weeks later, she was dead. The prosecution cross-examined aggressively, trying to establish that Sarah's memories might be colored by grief and time, that her interpretation of Rebecca's relationship might not be accurate. But Sarah held firm, her testimony unwavering. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a clinical psychologist specializing in domestic violence, testified next. She walked the jury through the patterns of abuse in teenage relationships, how young victims often hide the abuse out of shame or fear, how isolation is a key tactic of abusers. In cases like Rebecca's, where the victim dies by suicide, it's crucial to understand the role coercive control plays. Dr. Morrison explained. The abuser creates a psychological prison. The victim feels there's no escape. Suicide can seem like the only way out. Is it your professional opinion that Rebecca Wilson was in an abusive relationship? Jennifer asked. Based on the evidence, the text messages, witness statements, medical records, and patterns of behavior, yes. Rebecca exhibited classic signs of being in a coercively controlling relationship. And the investigation into her death? Dr. Morrison's expression hardened. Inadequate doesn't begin to cover it. The investigators seem to have decided it was a suicide before they examined the context. They didn't interview her friends thoroughly, didn't look at her phone records, didn't consider that someone who was planning to attend college in the fall might not actually be suicidal. They saw a dead teenage girl and made assumptions. The most powerful testimony came from Aisha Martinez, Rebecca's best friend, now 40 years old and a social worker. She'd flown in from Seattle to testify, and her anger at the system was palpable. I told the police everything, Aisha said, her voice shaking. I told them David was controlling, that Rebecca was terrified of him, that she'd showed me bruises. I told them David had a temper, that I'd seen him grab her arm hard enough to leave marks. And you know what the detective said to me? She looked directly at the jury. He said, teenage relationships are dramatic. It doesn't mean anything sinister. He dismissed everything I said. What happened after Rebecca died? Jennifer asked gently. I blamed myself. I still do. I should have done more, said more. But I also blamed the police, because I'd given them information that should have raised red flags, and they ignored it. When I heard about Mrs. Wilson's arrest, my first thought was good, because someone finally made him pay for what he did. Do you think Charlotte Wilson should have killed David Chen? No. I think the police should have arrested him. I think the system should have protected Rebecca. But since it didn't, Aisha trailed off, then continued more firmly. I understand why she did it. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. The prosecution brought forward their own witnesses. David Chen's friends who described him as kind and generous. Teachers who'd found him polite and engaged. David's younger brother, Marcus Chen, now 32, testified about growing up with David, about his brother's dreams of becoming a chef, about the hole his death had left in their family. David wasn't perfect, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. He could be moody, quick to anger, but he was my big brother. He taught me how to ride a bike, helped me with homework, stood up for me when I was bullied. He was 19 years old. He deserved a chance to grow up, to become better. Charlotte Wilson took that from him. She took him from all of us. The testimony was effective, humanizing David in ways that complicated the narrative. Jennifer didn't challenge it aggressively. She couldn't argue that David hadn't been loved, hadn't been someone's son and brother. But on cross-examination, she asked careful questions. Did David ever talk to you about his relationship with Rebecca? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Not much. He said they'd broken up shortly before she died, that she'd been struggling with depression. Did he ever mention arguing with her? Couples argue. That's normal. Did he ever mention her accusing him of being controlling or abusive? Marcus's face clouded. He said she'd accused him of stuff that wasn't true, that she was being dramatic. And you believed him? He was my brother. Of course I believed him. Jennifer nodded slowly. Did your brother have a temper? Objection, Amanda Chun called. Relevance. Your Honor, the defense is trying to establish the victim's character and propensity for violence, which is relevant to understanding why the defendant believed her daughter was in danger, Jennifer argued. Judge Ortiz considered. I'll allow it, But tread carefully, counselor. Marcus looked uncomfortable. David could get angry, yes. There were times when he'd punch walls or throw things when he was frustrated. But he never hurt anyone? Jennifer's voice was gentle but firm. Mr. Chen, are you absolutely certain of that? Marcus's silence spoke volumes. The trial moved toward its conclusion with closing arguments. Amanda Chen reiterated her case. Murder is murder, regardless of motive. The law exists to prevent vigilante justice. Charlotte Wilson had taken matters into her own hands and must face the consequences. Jennifer Park's closing argument was impassioned. Charlotte Wilson is guilty of killing David Chen. We've never disputed that. But guilt exists on a spectrum. There's a difference between a cold-blooded killer and a mother driven to an unthinkable act by grief and a system's failure. I'm not asking you to excuse what she did. I'm asking you to understand it, to acknowledge that she acted in a moment of anguish after watching her daughter be failed by everyone who should have protected her. She walked slowly in front of the jury box. 23 years ago, a 17-year-old girl died. The investigation into her death was incomplete, inadequate, and influenced by factors that had nothing to do with finding truth. If that investigation had been thorough, if David Chen had been held accountable for his abuse, Rebecca Wilson might be alive today. And Charlotte Wilson wouldn't be sitting here. Jennifer paused, making eye contact with each juror. Your verdict won't bring David Chen back. It won't bring Rebecca back. But it will send a message about what we value as a society. Do we value a rigid application of law regardless of context? Or do we acknowledge that justice is more complicated? That understanding why someone commits a crime matters when we decide how to punish it? The jury deliberated for 3 days. During that time, Charlotte remained in her cell, surprisingly calm. She'd said what needed to be said. The trial had accomplished what Jennifer had hoped. It had forced a public reckoning with how Rebecca's case had been handled, had sparked conversations about domestic violence and failed investigations. Whatever verdict came, Charlotte had made her daughter's story matter. That was worth something. On the 3rd day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, the same cast of characters returning to hear the conclusion. Charlotte stood as the jury filed in, trying to read their expressions and finding nothing. Have you reached a verdict? Judge Ortiz asked. Patricia Rodriguez, the foreperson, stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the 1st degree, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. Charlotte's knees buckled slightly, but she remained standing. Michael made a sound of distress behind her. Sarah gripped his hand. However, Patricia continued, and the courtroom fell silent. The jury wishes to recommend leniency in sentencing, given the extraordinary circumstances of this case. Judge Ortiz nodded slowly. The jury's recommendation is noted. Sentencing will be scheduled for 2 weeks from today. She looked at Charlotte. Mrs. Wilson, do you have anything you wish to say? Charlotte thought about all the words she'd spoken, all the explanations and apologies. In the end, there was only one thing left to say. I'm sorry, she said simply. To everyone affected by my actions, I'm sorry. And to Rebecca, I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry this was the best I could do. The courtroom erupted into chaos, supporters cheering the verdict while others shouted in protest. Judge Ortiz gavelled for order, but the noise continued. Charlotte was led away in handcuffs, and as she passed her children, she mouthed, I love you. In the hallway outside, reporters swarmed both families. The Chens issued a statement expressing disappointment with the jury's recommendation for leniency. Justice was not served today, Lily Chun said, her voice breaking. My son's life was worth more than this. Sarah and Michael stood together, facing the cameras. Our mother did a terrible thing, Michael said. But she did it out of love, not cruelty. We hope the court will take that into account. The country remained divided. But something had shifted. The trial had opened a conversation that couldn't be closed about domestic violence, about flawed investigations, about the price of institutional failure. Rebecca's name would be remembered now, not just as a suicide statistic, but as a victim who deserved better. And Charlotte, preparing for sentencing in her cell, finally allowed herself to cry. Not just for Rebecca, or for David, or for the families destroyed by their deaths, but for the impossible tragedy of it all. The way good intentions could lead to terrible actions. The way love could become rage. The way trying to achieve justice could create new injustice. There were no easy answers. There never had been. But at least now, people were asking the right questions. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was quieter than the trial had been. The media presence had diminished slightly, though cameras still lined the courthouse steps, and protesters, both for and against Charlotte, maintained their vigil behind the barriers. Judge Sandra Ortiz sat behind her bench, looking tired. She'd presided over hundreds of cases in her career, but few had weighed on her like this one. Before her sat Charlotte Wilson, a woman who'd confessed to murder, but had somehow become a symbol of something larger than her crime. "Mrs. Wilson, please stand," Judge Ortiz said. Charlotte rose, Jennifer Park beside her. Her children sat behind her, along with Mrs. Pacheco and a handful of other neighbors who'd remained loyal despite everything. On the other side of the courtroom, the Chen family waited. Smaller in number now, just Lily and Marcus, both looking exhausted by the months of public scrutiny. Judge Ortiz began speaking. "This case has presented me with one of the most difficult sentencing decisions of my career. The law is clear: you committed first-degree murder, a crime that typically carries a sentence of 25 years to life. However, the law also allows for judicial discretion when extraordinary circumstances exist." She paused, looking at Charlotte directly. "What you did was wrong. Unequivocally, morally, legally wrong. You took a life, robbed a family of their son, and lived with that secret for over 2 decades. No amount of justification can change those facts." Charlotte nodded, accepting this. "However," Judge Ortiz continued, "I cannot ignore the context that surrounded your crime. The investigation into your daughter's death was grossly inadequate. Evidence that should have been pursued was ignored. A young woman who was clearly in distress was failed by the very institutions meant to protect her. And you, as her mother, were left with nowhere to turn." The judge consulted her notes. "I've read the hundreds of letters submitted on your behalf. I've read the psychological evaluations that show you pose no danger to society. I've considered the jury's recommendation for leniency. And I've spent sleepless nights asking myself what justice looks like in a case like this." She looked at the Chen family. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that I understand your pain. Your son's death was a tragedy, and nothing I say today will diminish that. You deserved a thorough investigation into his death, just as the Wilsons deserved a thorough investigation into Rebecca's death. The failures of our system have compounded the tragedy you've all experienced." Lily Chen sat stone-faced, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "Charlotte Wilson," Judge Ortiz said, her voice firm, "I hereby sentence you to 15 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Additionally, I'm recommending you be placed in a facility with programs focused on restorative justice and victim advocacy. It is my hope that you will use your time in prison not just to atone for your crime, but to help prevent other families from experiencing the failures that led to this tragedy." The courtroom erupted. Some shouted that the sentence was too lenient, others that it was too harsh. The Chens sat in shocked silence. 15 years seemed like nothing for their son's life. Michael and Sarah embraced, crying with relief that their mother hadn't received life imprisonment. Charlotte simply closed her eyes and took a deep breath. 15 years. She would be 78 when she was eligible for parole. She might see her grandchildren graduate college, might hold great-grandchildren someday. It was more than she dared to hope for. Judge Ortiz gavelled for order. "Furthermore," she said once the noise subsided, "I am ordering a comprehensive review of how this court handles domestic violence cases involving minors. The failures that led to Rebecca Wilson's death and subsequently to David Chen's death cannot be allowed to happen again. I'm establishing a task force to examine our procedures and make recommendations for reform." This announcement was met with cheers from Charlotte's supporters. Jennifer Park squeezed Charlotte's shoulder, a rare show of emotion. "Court is adjourned," Judge Ortiz said, and brought down her gavel one final time. Charlotte was led away, but not before she turned to face the Chen family. Lily Chen met her eyes, and for a moment, two mothers who'd lost everything stared at each other across the courtroom. There was no forgiveness in Lily's gaze, but there was something else, a weary recognition of shared grief, of parallel losses that would never heal. Charlotte nodded once, an acknowledgement, and then she was gone. The California Institution for Women in Corona became Charlotte's new home. It was a stark contrast to the county jail, larger, more institutional, filled with women serving longer sentences. Charlotte was assigned to a cell with a woman named Gloria, a 55-year-old serving time for embezzlement who'd been inside for 8 years. First time, Gloria asked, helping Charlotte unpack her few belongings. For prison, yes, not for jail. Charlotte laid out the photos Michael had brought. Her children, grandchildren, one of Tom and Rebecca from before everything went wrong. What are you in for? Murder. Charlotte said it plainly, no longer flinching from the word. Gloria nodded, unsurprised. The cold case lady. Everyone's heard about you. You're famous in here. Charlotte hadn't expected that. But as the days passed, she realized Gloria was right. Other inmates approached her. Some curious, some hostile, most just wanting to talk. Her story had resonated with many women who'd experienced their own failures of justice. One woman, Shanice, was serving 20 years for killing her abusive husband in self-defense after police had repeatedly refused to intervene. Another, Kathy, had been imprisoned for attempting to protect her daughter from a violent father. Their stories were different from Charlotte's, but they shared a common thread. Women pushed to extremes by systems that failed them. Charlotte found herself becoming something she'd never intended to be, a reluctant advocate. In group therapy sessions, she talked about the warning signs of abuse she'd missed with Rebecca. In the prison library, where she volunteered, she helped other inmates research domestic violence laws and resources for their families on the outside. 6 months into her sentence, Jennifer Park visited with news. The Rebecca Wilson Foundation has officially launched, she said, smiling. Sarah and Michael are running it. They're working with local schools to provide education about healthy relationships and domestic violence recognition. They've already reached over 5,000 students. Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. Rebecca's name will mean something. More than that, the task force Judge Ortiz created? They've already implemented new protocols. Every case involving potential domestic violence now requires multiple interviews, a review by a specialized unit, and mandatory follow-up. It's not perfect, but it's better. Is it helping? Charlotte asked. Are there fewer Rebeccas? Too early to tell long-term. But 2 months ago, a girl came forward about an abusive boyfriend. Because of the new protocols, she was believed immediately. He was arrested. She got the support she needed. She's safe now. Jennifer leaned forward. That's Rebecca's legacy, Charlotte. That girl is alive because of what came from her death. The thought was both comforting and devastating. One girl saved didn't bring Rebecca back, didn't justify what Charlotte had done. But it was something. A ripple of good in an ocean of tragedy. Time in prison moved strangely. Days crawled while years flew. Charlotte established routines. She attended every parenting class offered, wanting to understand what she'd missed with Rebecca. She participated in restorative justice programs, learning to sit with the harm she'd caused without excusing it. She wrote letters to the Chen family, not expecting responses, just trying to acknowledge their ongoing pain. Lily Chen wrote back once, 3 years into Charlotte's sentence. The letter was brief. You took my son from me. I will never forgive you. But I read about the foundation, about the work your children are doing in Rebecca's name. I'm starting my own foundation in David's name, focused on giving young people second chances and rehabilitation programs. I won't let his memory be only about what happened at the end. He was more than his worst moments, just as your daughter was more than her last days. I thought you should know. Charlotte read the letter dozens of times, crying each time. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Both mothers were trying to wrest meaning from meaningless tragedy. They were walking parallel paths of grief, separated by their losses but united by their determination that their children's deaths wouldn't be in vain. Michael visited monthly, bringing his children when they were old enough to understand. Daniel, now 10 years old, asked hard questions. "Did you really kill someone, Grandma?" "Yes," Charlotte said honestly. "I did something very wrong because I was in a lot of pain, and I thought it was the only way to make things right. But I was mistaken. Violence doesn't fix violence. It just creates more pain." "Are you sorry?" Charlotte thought carefully about her answer. "I'm sorry that I hurt people. I'm sorry that David's family lost their son. I'm sorry that my actions have affected our family. But I'm not sorry that I tried to stand up for your Aunt Rebecca, even though the way I did it was wrong." Daniel considered this, his young face serious. "Mom says you're a good person who did a bad thing. Your mom is wise." Charlotte smiled sadly. "People are complicated, Daniel. We're capable of both great love and terrible harm. The trick is learning which one to act on." Sarah visited less frequently. The pain was still too fresh, the betrayal too deep. But she sent letters, updating Charlotte on the foundation's work, sharing news about her students. Slowly, tentatively, they were rebuilding something. Not the relationship they'd had before, which had been built on lies, but something more honest and therefore more fragile. In year 5, Charlotte's case was featured in a documentary about the American justice system. The filmmaker interviewed her extensively, along with both families, the detectives, the lawyers. The resulting film, When Justice Fails, won awards and reignited conversations about vigilante justice and institutional failures. Charlotte watched it in the prison common room, surrounded by other inmates. Seeing her story laid out so clinically was surreal. Her tragedy reduced to a 90-minute narrative with a clear beginning, middle, and end. But she was glad it existed. Every time someone watched it and thought differently about domestic violence, about flawed investigations, about the human cost of systemic failures, it gave Rebecca's death additional meaning. In year 7, Charlotte was granted permission to speak to a criminology class at a nearby university via video conference. She talked about the progression of her crime, from the first moment of rage to the cover-up that lasted decades. She talked about the psychological toll of living with a secret, how it had poisoned every good moment with guilt. A student asked, "If you could go back, what would you do differently?" Charlotte thought about this question often. "Everything," she said finally. "I would fight harder to get Rebecca help before it was too late. I would document everything, hire a lawyer, make so much noise that someone would have to listen. I would exhaust every legal option before considering violence. But if I'm being completely honest, if I couldn't save her through those means, if the system still failed her, I don't know. I'd like to think I'd make a different choice. But grief and rage are powerful forces. I can't promise I wouldn't end up exactly where I am now." The honesty in her answer was what made it powerful. She wasn't performing redemption or offering easy answers. She was acknowledging the messy reality of being human, capable of monstrous actions, capable of remorse, incapable of simple categorization as good or evil. By year 8, the California Institution for Women had changed significantly. The reforms Judge Ortiz had championed had rippled outward, affecting not just case investigations but also how the justice system thought about rehabilitation versus punishment. Charlotte found herself part of a pilot program where inmates could mentor at-risk youth, teaching them about consequences and choices. She met with a 15-year-old girl named Maya whose boyfriend was showing early signs of controlling behavior. Maya reminded Charlotte painfully of Rebecca, bright, defensive, convinced that love meant accepting treatment that no one should accept. "He only gets upset when I talk to other guys," Maya said, echoing words Charlotte had heard her own daughter say. "He says it's because he loves me so much." Charlotte spoke gently but firmly. "Love doesn't control. Love doesn't isolate. Love doesn't hurt. What you're describing isn't love. It's possession. And it will only get worse. But I love him. I can help him change. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. And trying will destroy you." Charlotte reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of Maya's. "I lost my daughter to someone like your boyfriend. Please, please don't let your family lose you." 2 weeks later, Maya's mother called Jennifer Park to say Maya had ended the relationship and was seeing a counselor. It was a small victory, one girl among thousands, but it mattered. Charlotte had saved someone Rebecca's memory. She'd prevented one tragedy from compounding. In year 9, Charlotte's parole hearing was scheduled. She'd been a model prisoner, no infractions, active participation in programs, consistent demonstration of remorse and rehabilitation. Her children testified on her behalf, talking about the grandmother their children needed, the work she could do on the outside to continue Rebecca's legacy. The Chen family testified against parole. Marcus spoke about the hole in their family that would never be filled, about his mother's health deteriorating under the weight of grief. "No amount of time can repay the debt she owes," he said. "My brother doesn't get a second chance. Why should she?" The parole board deliberated for weeks. Charlotte waited in a state of suspended animation, neither hoping nor despairing, just existing in the liminal space between punishment and freedom. The answer came in the form of a letter. Parole denied. She would serve her full 15 years. Charlotte felt a strange mix of emotions. Disappointment, yes, but also something like relief. She'd done a terrible thing. Maybe 15 years was what she owed. She wrote to Michael and Sarah, "I'm okay. This is fair. Use the extra time to make the foundation even stronger. Make Rebecca's name mean even more. That's what matters." The final 6 years passed in a blur of routine and reflection. Charlotte became a grandmother figure to many younger inmates, offering advice and perspective. She completed a degree in counseling through a prison education program. She wrote a memoir, though she never sought to publish it. It was just an attempt to make sense of her life, to trace the path from loving mother to murderer and back to something resembling human. When she was 65 years old, Charlotte developed breast cancer. The prison medical system caught it early, and she underwent treatment within the facility. Facing mortality made her think differently about her crime. She'd taken David Chen's chance at a full life. Now she was fighting for her own. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Do you think you deserve to survive?" a therapist asked during one of their sessions. "I don't know," Charlotte admitted, "but I think Rebecca would want me to." She always believed in second chances, in people being more than their worst moments. "Maybe I owe it to her to keep living, keep trying to make amends." She survived the cancer. The treatments left her weaker, frilier, but alive. And as she approached her 78th birthday and her release date, Charlotte thought about the girl she'd been at 15, full of dreams and unaware of the tragedies that awaited her. She thought about Rebecca at 15, still bright-eyed and safe. She thought about David at 15, before whatever darkness grew in him took root. At what point do we become who we are? At what point do our choices define us beyond redemption? Charlotte didn't know. She only knew that she'd been many people in her life. Daughter, wife, mother, grandmother, murderer, prisoner, advocate. Each identity was real. Each was part of the complicated truth of being human. As her release date approached, Charlotte felt no joy, only a quiet determination. She would leave prison and dedicate whatever years remained to the work that had become her penance and purpose, preventing other families from experiencing the failures that had destroyed so many lives. Rebecca's name would live on, not as a tragedy, but as a catalyst for change. And Charlotte would carry her daughter's memory, along with the weight of David Chen's death, until the day she died. It wasn't redemption. It was something more honest than that: acknowledgement of harm done, commitment to preventing future harm, and acceptance that some things can never be made right, only lived with. 2 years after release, 2028. Charlotte stood in front of a high school auditorium filled with teenagers, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the podium. At 80 years old, she cut a fragile figure, but her voice was strong. "My name is Charlotte Wilson, and 26 years ago, I murdered someone," she began. The room fell silent. "I'm not here to justify what I did or to ask for your sympathy. I'm here to tell you about my daughter, Rebecca, and how the system failed her. I'm here to prevent you from becoming either a victim or someone like me, someone who lets rage override reason." She spoke for 40 minutes, sharing Rebecca's story, her own crime, the years in prison, and the lessons she'd learned. When she finished, hands shot up across the auditorium. A girl in the third row asked, "Do you think you deserve to go to prison?" "Yes," Charlotte said without hesitation. "What I did was wrong. But I also think the system that allowed Rebecca's abuse to continue, that dismissed evidence and closed her case without proper investigation, deserved to be held accountable too. We're working on that second part through the foundation." After her talk, a young woman approached her privately. She was 17, the same age Rebecca had been. "My boyfriend, he's like David, what you described. And I don't know what to do." Charlotte's heart clenched. "You talk to someone, not just anyone. Talk to people who will help. There are resources now that didn't exist when Rebecca was alive. The foundation can connect you." She pulled out a card. "This is my daughter Sarah's direct line. Call her. Today. Don't wait." The girl took the card with shaking hands. What if I love him? What if he can change? Then he needs to change away from you while you're safe," Charlotte said gently. "Love shouldn't hurt. Remember that. Love shouldn't hurt." 4 years after release, 2030, the Rebecca Wilson Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. It operated in 12 states now, providing education, resources, and direct support to victims of domestic violence. Sarah had left teaching to run it full-time, and Michael served on the board while maintaining his tech career. Charlotte visited the foundation's headquarters, a modest building in downtown San Jose, and walked through the halls covered with photos. Pictures of Rebecca, yes, but also pictures of other young women and men they'd helped. Each photo had a story. Emily left her abusive relationship, now studying law. Joshua recognized his own controlling behaviors and got help before it was too late. Maria survived, thriving. In one room, Charlotte found a memorial wall. Half was dedicated to Rebecca, with photos spanning her short life. The other half was dedicated to David Chen. At first, this had angered her. Why memorialize her daughter's killer? But Sarah had explained, "We remember David to acknowledge that he was human too, that he could have been helped before he hurt anyone, that the system failed him as well by not intervening in whatever made him abusive. Both are tragedies." Charlotte had come to accept this. David hadn't been born a monster. Something had twisted in him, and no one had caught it in time. If the goal was to prevent future tragedies, they had to acknowledge all aspects of how people became who they were. Lily Chun had been invited to the memorial wall unveiling but hadn't come. However, the David Chen Second Chances Foundation, focused on counseling programs for troubled youth, had sent flowers and a note. Working toward the same goals from different paths. With respect, Lily Chen. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was communication. Small steps toward something neither woman could name but both needed. 7 years after release, 2033. Charlotte's health was failing. The cancer had returned, more aggressive this time. She declined aggressive treatment, choosing quality of life over quantity. At 85, she'd lived longer than she'd expected when she'd first been sentenced. Her family gathered around her. Michael, Sarah, 6 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren she'd been blessed to meet. Daniel, now 26 and studying criminal justice, sat by her bedside. "You know I'm becoming a prosecutor, right?" he said with a gentle smile. "I'm going to put bad guys away." "Good," Charlotte said weakly. "But remember, there's rarely a clear line between good and bad. We're all capable of both. Your job is to seek justice, but also to understand." "I learned that from you, Grandma. The hard way." The wooden box with the lotus flower sat on Charlotte's hospital bedside table. She'd finally read Rebecca's journal, years ago in prison, and it had broken her heart all over again. Rebecca had documented everything. Her fears, David's escalating control, her plans to leave him after graduation. She'd been so close to escaping. "Make sure this goes to the Foundation archives," Charlotte told Sarah, touching the box. "Let researchers use it. If Rebecca's words can help someone understand the psychology of abuse from the victim's perspective, let them help." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I need to tell you something. I forgive you. Took years and therapy and a lot of anger. But I understand now that you were human and flawed, and that you made a terrible choice out of unbearable pain. I forgive you. Thank you, Charlotte whispered. But I'm not sure I forgive myself. Maybe that's okay too, Sarah said. Maybe some things we just have to carry. Charlotte closed her eyes, thinking about all the lives that had been destroyed and saved because of one terrible night in 2002. She thought about Rebecca, forever 17, forever frozen in time before life could really begin. She thought about David, robbed of the chance to grow beyond his worst self. She thought about all the other Rebeccas and Davids they'd helped through the foundation. Each life a small redemption that could never balance the scales but mattered anyway. 10 years after release, 2036. Charlotte Wilson died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, surrounded by her family. She was 88 years old. Her obituary ran in the San Jose Mercury News, a complicated summary of a complicated life. Charlotte Wilson, founder of the Rebecca Wilson Foundation, died Tuesday. She was a mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and convicted murderer who spent her final years advocating for domestic violence prevention. Her funeral was private, just family, but hundreds sent flowers. Among them, a simple arrangement from Lily Chen with a card that read, "You loved your daughter. I loved my son. We both deserved better than what we got. Rest in peace." The foundation didn't close with Charlotte's death. Instead, it expanded, adding a new program called Charlotte's Conversations. Speakers who'd made terrible mistakes and were willing to talk honestly about consequences, choices, and the complexity of justice. Not to excuse their actions, but to provide real-world context for how quickly lives could go off the rails. Michael took over as executive director. At Charlotte's request, he reached out to Marcus Chun to see if the two foundations might collaborate on some initiatives. Marcus agreed to a meeting. They met at a neutral coffee shop, two middle-aged men carrying the weight of their families' histories. "I don't forgive your mother," Marcus said first, making his position clear. "I understand," Michael said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking if we can work together to prevent other families from ending up like ours." They talked for 2 hours. By the end, they'd outlined a joint program bringing together families affected by violence from all perspectives. Victims, perpetrators, those who'd lost loved ones. Not to achieve forgiveness or reconciliation, but to humanize all sides and show teenagers the real, complex cost of violence. The program launched a year later. It was controversial. Some people thought it was inappropriate to give platforms to perpetrators or their families. But the students who participated reported that it changed how they thought about violence, justice, and responsibility. It wasn't simple anymore. It was real. 15 years after Charlotte's release, 2041. Daniel Wilson, Charlotte's grandson, was now a successful prosecutor specializing in domestic violence cases. He thought of his grandmother every time he reviewed a case, every time he pushed for thorough investigations, every time he ensured victims were heard. He was prosecuting a case involving a young woman named Lisa who'd been abused by her partner. The defense was arguing she'd provoked the violence, that she'd been unstable. Daniel thought about Rebecca, about how she'd been characterized after her death as dramatic and unstable when she'd actually been traumatized and afraid. "Your Honor," Daniel said during the trial, "the defense wants you to believe the victim somehow caused her own abuse. But we know, because we've learned from cases like Rebecca Wilson's 24 years ago, that abusers shift blame to their victims. That control and violence are choices the perpetrator makes, not responses the victim provokes." He won the case. The abuser was sentenced to 15 years, the same sentence his grandmother had received. Daniel thought about that symmetry. Both had committed violence. Both had been punished. But one had been trying to inflict control, the other trying to achieve justice. Did that distinction matter? Yes, Daniel decided. Intent mattered. Context mattered. Both deserved consequences, but understanding why people did terrible things was crucial to preventing future terrible things. 20 years after Charlotte's release, 2046. A doctoral student named Amanda Torres was writing her dissertation on vigilante justice and the failures of institutional systems. She interviewed Sarah and Michael Wilson extensively, reviewed court transcripts, and studied the ripple effects of Charlotte's crime. Her thesis: the Charlotte Wilson case represented a watershed moment in how American society discusses domestic violence, investigation protocols, and the limits of vigilante justice. While her actions were indefensible legally, they sparked reforms that have demonstrably saved lives. This paradox, that a crime can lead to good outcomes, challenges our simplistic notions of justice and morality. Amanda discovered that in the 2 decades since Charlotte's arrest, San Jose County's domestic violence investigation protocols had become a model for the nation. Cases were no longer closed quickly. Victims were believed and supported. The number of deaths from intimate partner violence in young people had dropped by 40% locally. How much of that is directly attributable to the Wilson case? Amanda asked Sarah during an interview. Impossible to measure exactly, Sarah said. She was 62 now, still running the foundation, though talking about retiring. But I know that before my mother's arrest, no one wanted to talk about how investigations could fail, how nice boys could be abusers, how mothers' concerns could be dismissed. After, it became impossible to ignore. So yes, I think Rebecca's death and my mother's crime, as terrible as both were, they mattered. They changed things. 25 years after Charlotte's release, 2051. The anniversary of Charlotte's death brought renewed media attention. A new generation was discovering her story through podcasts and documentaries. Some viewed her as a tragic figure, some as a criminal who'd gotten off too easy, some as a hero who'd stood up when the system failed. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any single narrative. On what would have been Rebecca's 67th birthday, the foundation held a memorial service. They did this every year, but this one felt particularly poignant. It had been nearly 50 years since Rebecca's death, and most of the people who'd known her personally were gone or aging. A young woman named Rebecca Martinez attended. She'd been named after Rebecca Wilson by her mother, who'd been one of the first people helped by the foundation back in 2003. She was now a social worker specializing in adolescent trauma. I never knew the original Rebecca, Rebecca Martinez said during the memorial. But I've lived my whole life in the shadow of her story. My mother left an abusive relationship because of this foundation. I exist because Rebecca Wilson's death meant something. I've dedicated my career to helping kids like she was. Her legacy isn't just in the foundation. It's in everyone who's been helped, who then helps others. It's an endless ripple. Sarah, now elderly herself, wiped tears from her eyes. This was what she'd wanted, for Rebecca to be remembered not as a tragedy, but as a catalyst. For her sister's too short life to mean something beyond its painful end. 30 years after Charlotte's release, 2056. Michael Wilson died at 82, having lived a full life despite the tragedy that had marked his family. At his funeral, his children shared stories about how he'd embodied forgiveness and complexity, how he'd taught them that people were more than their worst moments, that justice was about more than punishment. The foundation continued under new leadership, but the Wilson name remained attached. 3 generations of the family had now dedicated themselves to the work Charlotte had begun as penance. Preventing violence, supporting victims, pushing for systemic change. The wooden box with the lotus flower had been donated to the National Domestic Violence Museum in Washington, D.C. It sat in a display about Rebecca Wilson's story, accompanied by her journal excerpts, Charlotte's confession, photos of the investigation failures, and documentation of the reforms that had followed. Visitors stood before the display, reading Rebecca's words, "I love him, but I'm afraid of him. Is that normal? I don't think it's normal. I need to get out, but I don't know how." And beside it, Charlotte's words from her prison memoir, "I failed my daughter while she was alive. Everything I did after she died was about that failure, trying to create justice where none existed, trying to make her death mean something, trying to forgive myself when forgiveness was impossible. I succeeded at some of those things, but I will never forgive myself. Maybe that's my real sentence." 50 years after Rebecca's death, 2052, 4 years before Michael's death. On the 50th anniversary of Rebecca's death in 2002, the city of San Jose erected a small memorial in the park where she'd loved to walk as a child. It wasn't about her murder or Charlotte's crime. It was simply a bench with a plaque, in memory of Rebecca Wilson, who loved the ocean and dreamed of saving it. May we create a world where dreams don't die with those who dream them. The memorial had been commissioned jointly by the Rebecca Wilson Foundation and the David Chen Second Chances Foundation. Lily Chen had died 2 years earlier, but Marcus Chen attended the unveiling. Sarah was there too, frail but determined. They didn't speak to each other, but they stood on opposite sides of the bench, both placing flowers, both acknowledging the complicated legacy they shared. Their families had been destroyed by violence and failure and rage. But from that destruction they'd built something, not redemption exactly, but purpose. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8, ran up to the bench and sat down, oblivious to the ceremony. She swung her legs and looked up at the trees, and for a moment, she could have been Rebecca at that age. Full of life, unaware of the dangers that would come. Sarah watched her and thought, this is what it's for. So girls like her can stay safe. So when they're in danger, someone listens. So they don't become statistics or cautionary tales. The girl's mother called her away, and she ran off laughing. The sound echoed through the park, bright and pure and alive. The present day. The story of Charlotte Wilson and Rebecca Wilson remains complicated. Legal scholars debate whether her sentence was appropriate. Advocates for domestic violence victims hold her up as someone who fought back when the system failed. Families of crime victims view her as someone who took the law into her own hands and destroyed another family. All of these perspectives contain truth. What's undeniable is that the case changed things. Investigations improved. Protocols were established. Lives were saved. The foundation bearing Rebecca's name has helped thousands of families avoid their tragedy. But it's also undeniable that David Chen died violently at 19, that his family suffered, that Charlotte's crime created new victims. Justice is never clean. Truth is never simple. In the end, perhaps the lesson is this: systems must work, or people will take justice into their own hands. When institutions fail the vulnerable, when power protects the powerful, when victims aren't believed, the consequences ripple outward in ways we can't control. Charlotte Wilson was a murderer. She was also a mother who loved her daughter. She was a woman who lived with unbearable pain and made an unforgivable choice. She was someone who spent the rest of her life trying to prevent others from experiencing what she'd experienced, from doing what she'd done. She was, in other words, human, capable of profound love and terrible violence, deserving of punishment and capable of growth. Impossible to reduce to a simple story with a clear moral. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the work of justice isn't to make stories simple, but to help us live with their complexity. To acknowledge harm while preventing future harm. To punish wrongdoing while addressing the conditions that create wrongdoers. Rebecca Wilson would have been 70 years old now. She might have been a marine biologist, might have saved coral reefs, might have had children and grandchildren. She might have lived a beautiful, full life. David Chen would have been 72. He might have owned a restaurant like his parents. He might have gotten help for whatever darkness lived in him. He might have become someone other than his worst self. Both deserved that chance. Neither got it. And in the space between those two lost lives, a foundation was built. Not to justify the violence, but to mean something in spite of it. To turn tragedy into change, pain into purpose, loss into legacy. The wooden box with the lotus flower still sits in the museum, a reminder that from the mud of trauma and violence, something can grow. Not redemption, that's too clean a word for such messy circumstances, but maybe transformation, maybe hope, maybe that's enough. Subscribe to Unsolved Justice, where silence is never forgotten.